On a quiet spring morning in southern Indiana, a routine welfare check led deputies to a scene that would leave an entire community searching for answers. Inside a modest home in the small city of Tell City, investigators discovered 23-year-old Halee Rathgeber. Her life had ended in an act of violence that stunned friends, family, and neighbors alike. There were no signs of a random break-in, no evidence that a stranger had forced their way inside. Instead, detectives quickly realized that the truth was likely much closer to home. As news of Halee's death spread, grief turned into disbelief. Those who knew her struggled to understand how someone described as caring, hard-working, and devoted to the people she loved could become the victim of such a brutal crime. But behind the headlines was a far more complicated story. It was a story of relationships, trust, and the devastating consequences of escalating conflict. Piece by piece, investigators would reconstruct the final hours of Halee's life, following physical evidence, witness statements, and digital records that painted an increasingly troubling picture. The investigation would eventually point towards someone who had once been part of Halee's everyday life, a person whose connection to her transformed this case from a mystery into a deeply personal tragedy. As detectives assembled the evidence, prosecutors prepared to argue that Halee's death was not the result of chance or sudden impulse, but a deliberate act carried out by someone she knew. The legal proceedings that followed would expose intimate details of the relationship, reveal the events leading up to that April morning in 2017, and force a grieving community to confront difficult questions about violence, accountability, and the warning signs that can go unnoticed until it is too late. This is not simply the story of a criminal investigation. It is the story of a young woman whose future was cut short, the determined effort to uncover the truth, and the pursuit of justice for a life that should have continued for decades to come. Over the course of this documentary, we will examine the evidence presented by investigators, the findings introduced in court, and the timeline that prosecutors used to reconstruct the crime. Every event has been drawn from publicly documented investigative records and court proceedings to present the most accurate account possible. Long before her name appeared in newspaper headlines, Halee Rathgeber was known simply as a daughter, a friend, and a young woman with plans for the future. Halee lived in Tell City, a close-knit community along the Ohio River in Perry County, Indiana. Like many small Midwestern towns, Tell City was a place where neighbors recognized one another, local businesses served generations of the same families, and news, whether joyful or tragic, spread quickly through the community. Born in 1993, Halee grew up surrounded by family and friends who remembered her as warm, compassionate, and approachable. Those closest to her often described her as someone who genuinely cared about other people. She had an easy smile, a kind personality, and a willingness to help those around her without expecting anything in return. Friends recalled that she enjoyed spending time with the people she loved and valued the simple moments that often define life in a small town. Whether gathering with family, meeting friends, or simply enjoying a quiet evening at home, Halee built strong relationships with those who knew her best. As she entered adulthood, Halee worked to establish an independent life. Like many young adults in their 20s, she balanced work, responsibilities, and personal relationships while looking ahead to what the future might hold. She was building a life one step at a time, creating routines and making plans that reflected the optimism of someone who believed there was still much to accomplish. But behind the ordinary rhythm of everyday life, one relationship had become increasingly complicated. Halee had been involved with Isaiah Hagan, a young man from the same area. At one point, the two shared a close relationship, but over time, that relationship deteriorated. The details of their personal lives remained largely private, but investigators would later uncover evidence suggesting that tensions between them had grown in the weeks leading up to Halee's death. Like many relationships that come to an end, there were disagreements, emotional strain, and unresolved issues. To outsiders, however, there was little indication that those problems would ultimately lead to a tragedy that would shock the entire community. In hindsight, investigators would carefully examine every interaction between Halee and Isaiah during the days before the crime. Phone records, text messages, witness interviews, and surveillance footage would all become critical pieces of a timeline that prosecutors later argued revealed an escalating conflict. At the time, however, Halee was simply living her life. No one close to her imagined that an ordinary weekend in April 2017 would become the final chapter of her story. The house where she lived represented comfort and familiarity, a place where family and friends expected her to be safe. It was there that she continued her daily routine, unaware that investigators would soon transform every room into a meticulously documented crime scene. For her family, life before April 23, 2017 would forever be divided into two parts: the time when Halee was still here and everything that came afterward. As investigators would later explain, understanding who Halee was as a person was essential to understanding the impact of the crime. She was far more than a victim in a homicide investigation. She was a young woman whose life touched countless others, leaving behind grieving parents, relatives, friends, and a community searching for answers. The investigation that followed would focus heavily on forensic evidence and courtroom testimony, but at its heart remained the life of a 23-year-old woman whose future ended far too soon. Before detectives could determine who was responsible, they first had to reconstruct Halee's final days, examining every decision, every conversation, and every encounter that led to the morning. Her loved ones realized something was terribly wrong. That search for answers was only beginning. This is the true story of Halee Rathgeber. Sunday, April the 23rd, 2017 began like any other spring day in southwestern Indiana. For 20-year-old Halee Rathgeber, there was little to suggest that the coming hours would become the focus of a homicide investigation that would dominate local headlines and eventually lead to a high-profile murder trial. Halee was a second-year nursing student at the University of Southern Indiana and, like many college students, balanced her education with work. She was employed at a Texas Roadhouse restaurant where she was known by coworkers as dependable and friendly. On that Sunday evening, she reported for what appeared to be an ordinary shift. As the restaurant grew quieter toward closing time, employees finished serving the last customers, cleaned their stations, and prepared to head home. Several coworkers later recalled inviting Halee to join them after work. She politely declined. There was nothing unusual about that decision. She had plans of her own. No one realized those would be the last conversations they would ever have with her. As the night progressed, Halee remained in contact with Isaiah Hagan, someone she had known personally. Although their romantic relationship had ended, they still communicated. Investigators would later discover that the two had arranged to meet that evening. According to statements Hagan later gave investigators, Halee owed him, or rather, she was bringing him money connected to an earlier financial matter. Detectives would eventually learn that the financial relationship between the two was far more complicated than it initially appeared. Investigators uncovered evidence indicating that money had passed between them in the past and that Hagan was facing significant financial difficulties at the time. Cell phone records would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in reconstructing that evening. Data extracted from the phones showed that Halee and Isaiah traveled together to the Alcoa soccer fields near Newburgh, Indiana, a quiet sports complex that at that late hour was largely deserted. The location was isolated with little activity after dark, making it an unlikely destination unless someone intended to meet there. During multiple interviews, Isaiah Hagan admitted that he had driven Halee to the soccer complex. His explanation, however, was that she was meeting another, unidentified person. He claimed he dropped her off, accepted approximately $200 that she allegedly owed him, received her keys so he could retrieve and sell concert tickets for her, and then drove away, leaving her standing near the entrance to the complex. He insisted that she was alive when he last saw her. Investigators would soon begin comparing that account with the digital evidence. Text messages exchanged between Isaiah and his father revealed a conversation centered on money. Shortly before the meeting, his father asked whether he had obtained the cash he needed. Isaiah responded that he was waiting for Halee to finish work and assured him that he would have the money before returning home. To detectives, those messages established more than just a timeline. They demonstrated that Halee's money was an important issue before the two met that night. At approximately 11:29 p.m., after he claimed he had already left the soccer fields, Isaiah sent Halee a text message thanking her for their conversation. By itself, the message appeared ordinary, but as investigators continued examining the timeline, that text and several actions that followed in the early hours of the next morning would receive intense scrutiny. What happened after the two arrived at the soccer fields has never been witnessed by anyone else. No independent eyewitness came forward to describe the final moments of Halee's life. Instead, detectives were forced to rely on forensic evidence, digital records, surveillance footage, and the statements given by the man who admitted he had been the last known person to see her alive. Sometime during that night, Halee Rathgeber suffered a single fatal gunshot wound to the head. Investigators later determined that she died at the soccer complex. Her body remained there through the night, undiscovered in the darkness beside the entrance to the fields. A blue Comfort Bay towel lay beside her, an item that at first seemed insignificant but would later become one of the most important physical clues in the entire investigation. While Halee lay at the deserted sports complex, life continued as normal throughout the surrounding communities. Drivers passed along nearby roads, families prepared for another work week. Friends assumed Halee had simply gone home after work. No one yet realized that before sunrise, a passerby would make a discovery that would transform an ordinary Monday morning into the beginning of a homicide investigation. By daybreak, detectives would be racing to secure a crime scene, identify a victim, and answer the most urgent question of all: who had taken the life of 20-year-old Halee Rathgeber? As the first light of Monday, April 24, 2017, spread across Warwick County, the quiet surroundings of the Alcoa soccer fields appeared no different from any other spring morning. The parking areas were still largely empty. The fields, usually filled with athletes and families during the day, sat silent beneath the early morning sky. Nothing about the location hinted at the tragedy that had unfolded there only hours earlier. Then, shortly after sunrise, someone made a discovery that would immediately change the course of the day. Near the entrance to the soccer complex lay the body of a young woman. Emergency responders were dispatched to the scene, and within minutes, deputies from the Warwick County Sheriff's Office arrived. The area was quickly secured with crime scene tape as investigators began treating the location as a potential homicide. The victim showed no signs of life. As detectives conducted their initial assessment, they observed what appeared to be a gunshot wound to her head. It quickly became apparent that this was not an accidental death. The victim was soon identified as 20-year-old Halee Rathgeber. For her family, the devastating news would soon arrive. Only hours earlier, Halee had finished what should have been an ordinary shift at work. Now, detectives were preparing to tell her loved ones that she would never be coming home. As crime scene investigators carefully documented every inch of the area, they photographed the position of the body, collected physical evidence, and searched for anything that could explain what had happened during the previous night. Nearby, investigators located a blue Comfort Bay towel lying close to Halee's body. At first glance, it appeared to be an ordinary household item, but experienced detectives understood that even the smallest object at a homicide scene could become a crucial piece of evidence. The towel was carefully collected, packaged, and sent for forensic examination. Detectives had no way of knowing it yet, but later laboratory testing would reveal DNA evidence that prosecutors would argue directly connected the crime scene to Isaiah Hagan. Investigators also searched for shell casings, tire impressions, footprints, and any other trace evidence that might identify the person responsible. Every photograph, every measurement, and every item collected became part of an expanding investigation that would eventually include forensic scientists, digital analysts, and prosecutors. One fact immediately stood out: there were no obvious signs of a robbery. Personal belongings associated with Halee remained at the scene, leading investigators to question whether theft had ever been the motive. Instead, the evidence suggested that whoever killed her may have specifically targeted her. As detectives expanded their search, they began reconstructing Halee's final known movements. Every homicide investigation begins with the same fundamental questions: who was the victim, who last saw them alive, and what evidence can reveal what happened during the hours leading up to their death. For detectives, those questions quickly narrowed their attention to a single individual. Isaiah Hagan. It did not take long for investigators to learn that Hagan had been in contact with Halee on the night of April 23, 2017. Through interviews with friends, co-workers, and family members, detectives established that Halee had left work intending to meet him. That fact immediately made him the last known person confirmed to have been with her before she died. Investigators requested that Hagan come in for an interview. He agreed. During his initial conversation with detectives, Hagan appeared cooperative. He admitted that he and Halee had spent time together that evening and acknowledged driving her to the Alcoa soccer fields near Newburgh. According to his account, however, their meeting had been brief. He told investigators that Halee was expecting to meet another person at the soccer fields. He claimed she had given him approximately $200 connected to a financial matter between them and handed him her vehicle keys so he could retrieve concert tickets from her car to sell on her behalf. After that, he said, he left the area, believing Halee would remain there to meet someone else. Detectives carefully documented every detail of his statement. Experienced investigators understand that the first interview often becomes the benchmark against which all later evidence is measured. If new information emerges that contradicts an initial account, those inconsistencies can become significant. Rather than immediately challenge Hagan's version of events, detectives began looking for independent evidence that could either support or disprove his claims. They obtained search warrants for cell phone records belonging to both Halee and Hagan. The resulting data proved invaluable. Location information placed both phones traveling together toward the Alcoa soccer fields late on the evening of April 23rd. The records confirmed that they had been in the same general location during the time Hagan admitted they were together. But investigators wanted to know what happened after that. Did Halee's phone continue moving after Hagan claimed he had left? Did either phone communicate with another individual who might support his explanation? As analysts examined the records, they found no evidence that another person had arranged to meet Halee at the soccer fields that night. Instead, the digital timeline increasingly centered on the interactions between Halee and Hagan. Investigators also reviewed text messages exchanged before the meeting. Among the most significant were conversations involving Hagan and his father. In those messages, his father asked whether Hagan had obtained money he needed. Hagan responded that he was waiting for Halee to finish work and indicated that he expected to receive money from her. While receiving money from someone was not itself a crime, detectives viewed the messages as important because they established that financial concerns were a central topic before the two met. The investigation then expanded beyond digital records. Detectives interviewed Halee's co-workers, who confirmed that she had completed her shift as usual and appeared to be in normal spirits before leaving. None reported seeing her frightened or distressed. Friends and relatives were also questioned. Investigators wanted to understand the nature of Halee's relationship with Hagan following the end of their romantic involvement. Witnesses described a relationship that had become strained over time, though accounts varied regarding the extent of the conflict. Each interview helped detectives build a clearer picture of the days leading up to the homicide. Meanwhile, forensic scientists began examining the physical evidence recovered from the crime scene. The blue Comfort Bay towel found near Halee's body was submitted for DNA testing. Investigators also processed clothing, swabs, and other trace evidence collected from the scene, hoping that modern forensic techniques would identify anyone who had come into contact with the victim during her final hours. At the same time, the medical examiner conducted Halee's autopsy. The examination confirmed that she had died from a single gunshot wound to the head. The finding established the manner of death as homicide and provided investigators with critical medical evidence that would later support the prosecution's case. Although the autopsy explained how Halee died, it could not identify who pulled the trigger. That answer would have to come from the investigation itself. As detectives compared witness statements with digital evidence, subtle inconsistencies began to emerge. Some aspects of Hagan's account could be verified, others could not. Investigators became particularly interested in the sequence of events after he claimed to have left Halee at the soccer fields. They scrutinized his timeline minute by minute, comparing his statements with phone records, surveillance footage from surrounding areas, and other available evidence. Every discrepancy, no matter how small, was documented. Homicide investigations are rarely solved by one dramatic discovery. More often, they are built through the careful accumulation of facts, each reinforcing or contradicting another until a coherent picture begins to emerge. That was exactly what was happening in the Rathgeber investigation. By the end of the first stages of the inquiry, detectives had established a clear timeline placing Halee and Isaiah Hagan together shortly before her death. They had identified a possible financial motive for the meeting and had begun collecting forensic evidence that might confirm what occurred after the two arrived at the soccer fields. Still, investigators needed more. They needed evidence that could move the case beyond suspicion and establish, beyond a reasonable doubt, exactly what had happened during Halee's final moments. What had begun as a broad homicide investigation was steadily pointing toward one individual, Isaiah Hagan. From the beginning, detectives recognized that Hagan occupied a unique position in the timeline. He had openly admitted to meeting Halee Rathgeber on the night of her death and acknowledged driving with her to the Alcoa soccer fields. By his own account, he was the last known person to see her alive. That fact alone did not establish guilt. In any homicide investigation, the last person known to have been with the victim is routinely interviewed and their statements carefully examined. Detectives understood that facts, not assumptions, would determine where the evidence ultimately led. To verify Hagan's version of events, investigators compared his interviews with the growing body of forensic and digital evidence. Initially, Hagan maintained that after arriving at the soccer fields, Halee gave him approximately $200 and the keys to her vehicle. He claimed she intended to meet another person and that he simply left, believing she would remain there after his departure. But as detectives reconstructed the timeline, they struggled to find evidence supporting that explanation. They examined Halee's phone records, searching for communications that might identify the mysterious person Hagan claimed she intended to meet. Despite extensive analysis, investigators found no digital evidence confirming that another meeting had been arranged. The absence of such evidence did not conclusively disprove Hagan's account, but it raised important questions. If someone else had been expected, who were they? Why had no calls or messages been exchanged? And why had no witness come forward to report seeing another individual at the soccer complex that night? The investigation then turned to surveillance footage collected from businesses and roadways surrounding the area. Although no camera captured the exact location of the homicide, detectives used available footage to trace vehicle movements before and after the estimated time of the killing. Combined with cell phone location data, the recordings helped investigators build an increasingly precise timeline of Hagan's movements. Attention also focused on his communications before and after meeting Halee. Text messages recovered during the investigation revealed conversations between Hagan and his father regarding money. Before meeting Halee, Hagan indicated that he expected to receive cash from her after she finished work. Detectives considered those messages significant because they demonstrated that obtaining money from Halee had been an important objective that evening. Investigators then examined Hagan's behavior after the meeting. Rather than relying on a single interview, detectives conducted multiple conversations, comparing each statement with newly discovered evidence. As additional information emerged, investigators noted inconsistencies in portions of Hagan's account. While some details remained consistent, other aspects of his explanation became difficult to reconcile with the digital timeline. Experienced homicide investigators understand that inconsistencies do not automatically prove guilt. Memory can be imperfect, particularly during stressful events. However, when discrepancies repeatedly appear alongside physical evidence, they become increasingly important. The forensic examination of the crime scene soon provided another critical development. Among the evidence collected near Halee's body was the blue Comfort Bay towel discovered beside her. What initially appeared to be an ordinary household item became the focus of laboratory testing. Forensic scientists examined the towel for biological evidence. The testing identified DNA that investigators believed connected Isaiah Hagan to the item found at the crime scene. For detectives, this represented a significant breakthrough. According to prosecutors, the presence of Hagan's DNA on the towel was consistent with the theory that he had been present during the events surrounding Halee's death. While DNA evidence alone cannot establish precisely when or how an item was handled, its discovery near the victim added another important piece to the growing body of evidence. As laboratory results continued to arrive, investigators revisited Hagan's interviews. Each new finding was measured against his previous statements. Did the evidence support his explanation, or did it suggest a different sequence of events? The cumulative effect of the investigation began shifting the case. No single piece of evidence stood alone. Instead, detectives saw a pattern emerging. Cell phone records placed Hagan with Halee during her final known hours. His own statements confirmed he had driven her to the location where her body was later found. Financial communications established that money had been exchanged that evening. Forensic evidence recovered near the victim appeared to connect him to the crime scene. And investigators had found no evidence supporting the existence of the unidentified individual Hagan claimed Halee was meeting. By this stage of the investigation, detectives believed they had moved beyond mere suspicion. They continued gathering evidence carefully, aware that every conclusion would eventually face scrutiny in court. Search warrants were executed, additional forensic examinations were completed, and prosecutors worked closely with investigators to determine whether the evidence met the legal standard necessary to file a murder charge. For Halee's family, the investigation offered cautious hope that the person responsible would be identified. For Isaiah Hagan, the investigation was entering a far more serious phase. The evidence was no longer being evaluated simply to understand what had happened. It was being assembled to determine whether detectives could prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the last person known to see Halee Rathgeber alive was also the person responsible for ending her life. The next step would transform the investigation from a search for answers into a criminal prosecution, as detectives prepared to place Hagan under arrest and formally accuse him of murder. By the time investigators had completed the initial phase of the homicide investigation, they had assembled a growing collection of evidence. Individually, each piece told only part of the story. Together, detectives believed they revealed what had happened during Halee Rathgeber's final hours. The challenge facing investigators was no longer identifying a potential suspect. It was proving their theory beyond a reasonable doubt. To accomplish that, detectives continued examining every available source of evidence. Digital records, forensic testing, witness interviews, and physical exhibits recovered during the investigation. One of the most significant forms of evidence came from cell phone analysis. Specialists reconstructed the movements of both Halee Rathgeber's and Isaiah Hagan's phones during the evening of April 23, 2017. The location data confirmed that the devices traveled together toward the Alcoa soccer fields, matching Hagan's own admission that he and Halee had met that night. The digital timeline established that Hagan had been with Halee during the final confirmed period of her life. Although Hagan maintained that he left while she waited to meet someone else, investigators found no electronic evidence supporting the existence of that meeting. No text messages, no phone calls, no location data indicating another person had arrived to meet Halee. As detectives compared the digital records with witness statements, the gap between Hagan's explanation and the available evidence became increasingly difficult to ignore. The investigation also focused on Hagan's communications before meeting Halee. Messages exchanged with his father showed that he expected to receive money from her after she finished work. Prosecutors later argued that these conversations demonstrated that financial concerns played a central role in the events leading up to the meeting. While money alone did not explain a homicide, investigators considered the messages an important part of establishing motive and context. Meanwhile, forensic scientists continued processing evidence collected from the crime scene. Among the items submitted for laboratory analysis was the blue Comfort Bay towel found beside Halee's body. DNA testing identified Isaiah Hagan's DNA on the towel. For investigators, the result represented one of the strongest pieces of physical evidence in the case. Standing alone, DNA cannot determine exactly when an object was touched or how it arrived at a location. However, prosecutors argued that the towel's presence beside Halee's body, combined with the other evidence placing Hagan with her shortly before her death, significantly strengthened the state's case. Detectives carefully considered every possible explanation for the DNA evidence. Could the towel have been left there on another occasion? Had it been transferred innocently? Or did it directly connect Hagan to the crime scene? These were questions that would ultimately be debated in court. The medical examiner's findings also became a key part of the investigation. The autopsy confirmed that Halee had died from a single gunshot wound to the head. The manner of death was ruled a homicide, eliminating any possibility that her death had resulted from an accident or self-inflicted injury. Investigators then worked to establish the sequence of events following the shooting. By examining digital evidence, interviews, and physical evidence recovered at the scene, detectives concluded that Halee had been killed at or near the soccer fields where her body was discovered. There was no evidence suggesting that her body had been transported from another location. As the investigation progressed, detectives conducted additional interviews with Isaiah Hagan. Experienced investigators often revisit witnesses and suspects multiple times, knowing that repeated interviews may reveal inconsistencies or produce additional information. During these conversations, Hagan continued to deny involvement in Halee's death. He maintained that he had simply left the soccer fields after dropping her off. Investigators documented every statement. Rather than relying on a confession, they concentrated on corroborating or disproving his account through independent evidence. That approach would become one of the strengths of the prosecution's eventual case. The investigation was built not on a single eyewitness or admission of guilt, but on multiple forms of evidence that prosecutors argued all pointed in the same direction. The digital timeline, the financial communications, the forensic evidence, the victim's final known movements, and Hagan's own acknowledgement that he had been with Halee shortly before she was killed. Each element reinforced the others. By late April 2017, detectives believed they had assembled sufficient probable cause to move the investigation into its next phase. The evidence no longer consisted of isolated facts. It had become a coherent narrative, one that investigators believed explained who had been with Halee, why they had met, and who was responsible for the fatal shot. Still, detectives understood that the investigation would now be tested under the highest standard. Every piece of evidence would be scrutinized by defense attorneys. Every forensic result would be challenged. Every witness would be questioned. Only a jury could ultimately determine whether the evidence proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. But before the case could reach a courtroom, investigators had one more critical step to take. Armed with months of investigative work, forensic analysis, and digital evidence, law enforcement prepared to formally accuse Isaiah Hagan of murdering Halee Rathgeber. The quiet investigation that had begun at a deserted soccer complex was about to become a criminal case watched closely by the entire community. As investigators reviewed the growing body of evidence, they reached a conclusion they believed was supported by the facts. Months of interviews, forensic analysis, digital records, and laboratory testing had gradually transformed the investigation from an unanswered homicide into a case centered on one suspect. The Warwick County Sheriff's Office worked closely with the Warwick County Prosecutor's Office to determine whether the evidence met the legal threshold for criminal charges. In a murder case, suspicion alone is never enough. Detectives must establish probable cause, a reasonable basis to believe that a specific individual committed the crime. Every piece of evidence must be carefully documented, every witness statement verified, and every forensic result reviewed before prosecutors move forward. For Halee Rathgeber's case, investigators believed they had reached that point. The evidence presented to prosecutors included Isaiah Hagan's own admission that he had been with Halee on the night of April 23, 2017. Cell phone records placed the pair together at the Alcoa soccer fields, the location where Halee's body was discovered the following morning. Investigators had also documented text messages concerning money before the meeting, along with forensic evidence that they argued connected Hagan to the crime scene. Based on that evidence, prosecutors authorized the filing of a murder charge against Isaiah Hagan. The arrest marked a significant turning point in the investigation. For months, detectives had quietly gathered evidence while avoiding public speculation. Now the case entered a new phase, one that would unfold in court under public scrutiny. Law enforcement officers took Hagan into custody without incident. As with any criminal defendant, he was presumed innocent under the law, and the filing of charges represented allegations that the prosecution would later be required to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Following his arrest, Hagan made his initial appearance before a judge. During the hearing, the formal charge of murder was read, and the court advised him of his legal rights. Arrangements were made for legal representation, and the judicial process officially began. News of the arrest spread rapidly throughout Tell City, Newburgh, and the surrounding communities. For many residents, the announcement brought a sense of cautious relief. The discovery of Halee's body had left people searching for answers, and now investigators were publicly identifying the person they believed was responsible. For Halee's family, however, the arrest did not lessen their grief. The filing of criminal charges could not undo what had happened or restore the future that had been taken from their daughter. Instead, it marked the beginning of what would become a long and emotionally difficult legal process. As required in criminal proceedings, investigators prepared a probable cause affidavit summarizing the evidence that supported the arrest. The document outlined the key facts gathered during the investigation. It described Hagan's admission that he had met Halee on the night of her death. It detailed the cell phone records placing both individuals at the soccer fields. It summarized text messages concerning money exchanged before the meeting. It also referenced forensic evidence recovered during the investigation, including DNA findings associated with the towel discovered near Halee's body. Although the affidavit presented the prosecution's theory of the case, it was not itself proof of guilt. Its purpose was to demonstrate that investigators had sufficient evidence to justify the arrest and allow the case to proceed through the court system. Defense attorneys began reviewing the evidence disclosed by prosecutors. As is common in serious criminal cases, they examined witness statements, forensic reports, laboratory findings, and digital records while preparing to challenge the state's interpretation of the evidence. No murder weapon had been recovered. There were no eyewitnesses to the shooting. The prosecution's case would therefore rely heavily on circumstantial evidence, forensic science, and the timeline established through digital records. Indiana law recognizes that circumstantial evidence can be just as persuasive as direct evidence when considered as a whole. Prosecutors believed that, taken together, the facts established a compelling case against Hagan. The defense, however, would argue that the evidence left room for reasonable doubt. Those competing interpretations would eventually be presented before a jury. In the months following the arrest, attorneys on both sides exchanged evidence, filed pre-trial motions, and prepared for one of the most important stages of the criminal justice process. Expert witnesses were identified. Forensic analysts prepared to explain laboratory findings. Investigators organized thousands of pages of reports, photographs, and digital records collected throughout the investigation. Each side understood that the trial would require jurors to carefully evaluate complex forensic evidence and determine whether the prosecution had met its burden of proof. For the community, the arrest answered one question. Investigators believed they knew who was responsible, but the most important question still remained unanswered. Could the state prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law? That answer would depend on the evidence presented before 12 jurors whose decision would determine Isaiah Hagan's future and whether Halee Rathgeber's family would finally receive the justice they had been seeking since that April morning in 2017. More than 2 years after Halee Rathgeber's death, the case finally reached the courtroom. The investigation had concluded, the evidence had been analyzed, and pretrial motions had been argued before the court. Now, the responsibility for determining Isaiah Hagan's guilt or innocence would pass from investigators to a jury. For Halee's family, the trial marked the beginning of another painful chapter. They would once again hear the details of her final hours, listen to testimony describing the crime scene, and see evidence that investigators had spent years collecting. It was an emotional process, but one they hoped would ultimately provide accountability for Halee's death. Isaiah Hagan entered the courtroom presumed innocent under the law. The prosecution carried the burden of proving every element of the murder charge beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense was under no obligation to prove Hagan's innocence. Instead, its role was to challenge the state's evidence and argue that the prosecution had failed to meet its legal burden. During opening statements, prosecutors outlined the timeline they believed had been established through months of investigation. They argued that Halee Rathgeber had met Isaiah Hagan after finishing work on the evening of April 23, 2017. The two traveled together to the Alcoa soccer fields near Newburgh. According to the state, Hagan was the last person known to see Halee alive, and the physical and digital evidence would demonstrate that no one else was responsible for her death. The defense presented a different interpretation. Attorneys acknowledged that Hagan had been with Halee that evening but maintained that he left her alive after dropping her off at the soccer fields. They argued that the state's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and that no eyewitness had observed the shooting. Over the following days, jurors heard testimony from investigators who had responded to the crime scene. They described discovering Halee's body near the entrance to the soccer complex and explained how the area had been secured while forensic specialists documented and collected evidence. Crime scene photographs, maps, and diagrams were introduced to help the jury understand the location where the homicide had occurred. The medical examiner then testified about the autopsy. The jury learned that Halee died from a single gunshot wound to the head and that the manner of death had been ruled a homicide. Although the medical testimony established how Halee died, it did not identify who fired the fatal shot. That question depended on the remaining evidence. Next came testimony from forensic specialists. One of the prosecution's most significant pieces of evidence involved the blue Comfort Bay towel recovered beside Halee's body. Laboratory analysts explained the DNA testing performed on the towel and described the results that investigators believed connected Isaiah Hagan to the item. Prosecutors argued that the DNA evidence supported their conclusion that Hagan had been present during the events surrounding Halee's death. Defense attorneys carefully cross-examined the forensic witnesses. They questioned the limitations of DNA analysis, emphasizing that the presence of DNA alone cannot establish precisely when an object was touched or prove exactly how it arrived at a particular location. The jury was reminded that forensic evidence must be considered alongside all other evidence presented during the trial. Digital forensic experts also testified. Using cell phone records and location data, they reconstructed the movements of both Halee and Hagan during the evening of April 23rd. The record showed that the two traveled together to the soccer fields, supporting Hagan's own acknowledgement that they had met that night. Jurors were also shown text messages exchanged before the meeting. Among the communications introduced into evidence were messages between Hagan and his father discussing money. Prosecutors argued that the conversations demonstrated Hagan's expectation that Halee would provide him with cash after finishing work. While the prosecution presented these messages as evidence of motive and context, the defense maintained that financial discussions did not prove murder. Throughout the trial, detectives explained how they had systematically investigated Hagan's claim that Halee intended to meet another person after he left. Jurors heard that investigators examined phone records, interviewed witnesses, and searched for evidence supporting that explanation. According to the testimony presented by the state, the investigation uncovered no independent evidence confirming the existence of the alleged meeting. As the trial progressed, prosecutors encouraged jurors to view the evidence as a complete picture rather than isolated facts. No eyewitness had seen the shooting. No confession had been obtained. No murder weapon had been recovered. Instead, the state argued that the combination of Hagan's admissions, digital evidence, forensic findings, and investigative conclusions formed a consistent and compelling account of what had happened. The defense urged the jury to approach the evidence differently. Attorneys argued that unanswered questions remained. They emphasized that circumstantial evidence, while legally valid, should be examined with great care. They challenged aspects of the investigation and maintained that the state had not eliminated every reasonable doubt. After both sides concluded their presentations, the attorneys delivered their closing arguments. Prosecutors reminded jurors that criminal cases are often proven through the cumulative weight of evidence rather than a single dramatic piece of proof. They argued that every major element of the investigation pointed toward the same conclusion, that Isaiah Hagan murdered Halee Rathgeber. The defense responded that suspicion, regardless of its strength, could never replace proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They urged jurors to carefully evaluate every exhibit, every witness, and every unanswered question before reaching a verdict. With the testimony complete and the legal instructions delivered by the judge, the fate of the case passed entirely into the hands of the jury. The courtroom fell silent as the jurors left to begin their deliberations. For Halee's family, the wait was agonizing. For Isaiah Hagan, the verdict would determine whether he would spend the rest of his life in prison. After years of investigation and days of testimony, everything now depended on 12 ordinary citizens weighing the evidence and deciding where the truth lay. After days of testimony, hours of cross-examination, and detailed presentations of forensic and digital evidence, the case of State of Indiana versus Isaiah Hagan was finally in the hands of the jury. For the prosecution, years of investigative work had led to this moment. For the defense, it was the final opportunity to persuade 12 jurors that the state had not met its burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. As deliberations began, the courtroom settled into an uneasy silence. Halee Rathgeber's family waited anxiously, knowing that the jury's decision could never erase their loss but might provide a measure of justice. Across the courtroom, Isaiah Hagan and his legal team waited for the verdict that would determine the rest of his life. Jurors carefully reviewed the evidence they had heard throughout the trial. They considered the testimony of investigators who reconstructed Halee's final movements. They revisited the digital evidence showing that Halee and Hagan had traveled together to the Alcoa soccer fields on the night of April 23, 2017. They weighed the forensic testimony regarding the DNA recovered from the blue Comfort Bay towel found near Halee's body. They also examined the text messages discussing money before the meeting and Hagan's own statements acknowledging that he had been the last known person to see Halee alive. The jury's responsibility was not to decide whether every question had been answered. Their duty was to determine whether the evidence, viewed as a whole, established Isaiah Hagan's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. After completing their deliberations, the jurors returned to the courtroom. The atmosphere was tense. Family members, investigators, attorneys, and members of the public stood as the jury filed into the room. The clerk asked whether a verdict had been reached. The foreperson responded that it had. The verdict was read aloud. The jury found Isaiah Hagan guilty of murder. For Halee's family, the announcement marked the end of a long and painful search for accountability. Although no verdict could restore the daughter they had lost, the jury's decision represented the legal system's conclusion that the evidence proved Hagan was responsible for her death. Isaiah Hagan showed little visible reaction as the verdict was announced. With the finding of guilt entered into the record, the case moved to the sentencing phase. At the sentencing hearing, the court considered the seriousness of the offense, the evidence presented during trial, and the impact the crime had on Halee's loved ones. Family members were given an opportunity to address the court through victim impact statements. Speaking directly to the judge, they described the profound loss they had endured since April 2017. They spoke of birthdays that would never again be celebrated together, family gatherings forever altered by Halee's absence, and the emotional pain that continued long after the investigation had ended. Their statements served as a reminder that homicide cases extend far beyond courtroom exhibits and forensic reports. Behind every piece of evidence is a family forced to rebuild their lives after an unimaginable tragedy. The defense also addressed the court, asking the judge to consider factors they believed were relevant in determining an appropriate sentence. After hearing from both sides, the judge delivered the court's decision. Isaiah Hagan was sentenced to 60 years in the Indiana Department of Correction for the murder of Halee Rathgeber. The sentence reflected the court's determination that the severity of the crime warranted a lengthy term of imprisonment under Indiana law. With sentencing complete, the criminal trial officially came to an end. For investigators, the outcome represented the conclusion of years of meticulous work. The digital evidence, forensic analysis, witness interviews, and countless hours spent reconstructing Halee's final hours had ultimately persuaded a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. For prosecutors, the verdict affirmed the case they had presented, that the evidence consistently pointed to Isaiah Hagan as the person responsible for Halee's death. For the defense, the legal process did not necessarily end with sentencing. Like many defendants convicted of serious crimes, Hagan retained the right to pursue post-conviction remedies through the appellate courts, where legal issues arising from the trial could be reviewed. But regardless of any future legal proceedings, one fact remained unchanged. Halee Rathgeber's life had been taken at just 20 years old. Her dreams, her education, her relationships, and the future she had been building all ended on a quiet April night in 2017. The verdict brought legal accountability. It could not bring closure in the fullest sense of the word. For Halee's family, there would always be an empty place at the table, milestones she would never reach, and memories that would forever be accompanied by loss. Yet the jury's decision ensured that the person found responsible for taking her life would also face the consequences imposed by the justice system. The courtroom proceedings had ended. But Halee Rathgeber's story, and the lessons it carries about violence, relationships, and the pursuit of justice, would continue to resonate long after the verdict was read. The criminal case against Isaiah Hagan came to an end with a conviction and a 60-year prison sentence. But for those who loved Halee Rathgeber, the passage of a verdict did not mark the end of their grief. Justice in the legal sense had been served, but justice could never restore the life that had been lost. Halee was only 20 years old. She was a nursing student with ambitions of building a career dedicated to helping others. Friends remembered her as compassionate, outgoing, and dependable. Her family remembered the countless moments that never made the headlines, the holidays spent together, the laughter shared around the dinner table, and the ordinary memories that suddenly became priceless after she was gone. Those are the losses that no courtroom can measure. In the years that followed, Halee's name continued to be remembered, not simply because of the crime, but because of the person she was before it. Her story became another painful reminder of how quickly violence can shatter lives, leaving families to carry a burden that never truly disappears. The investigation into Halee's murder also demonstrated the evolution of modern criminal investigations. There were no eyewitnesses who saw the fatal shooting. The murder weapon was never recovered. Instead, investigators relied on a careful combination of forensic science, digital evidence, witness interviews, surveillance footage, and meticulous investigative work to reconstruct the final hours of Halee's life. The case illustrated how a modern homicide investigation often depends on technology as much as traditional detective work. Cell phone records established a timeline. DNA evidence connected people and places. Digital communications revealed motives and relationships. Each individual piece may have appeared insignificant on its own, but together they formed a narrative that ultimately persuaded a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. Even after the conviction, the legal process continued. Isaiah Hagan exercised his right to appeal and later sought post-conviction relief, arguing that errors had occurred during his trial and presenting claims of newly discovered evidence. Indiana appellate courts rejected those challenges, leaving his conviction and 60-year sentence in place. For Halee's family, every appeal represented another reminder of the tragedy they had already endured. Each hearing required them to revisit memories they had spent years trying to process. Although the courts reaffirmed the conviction, no legal ruling could erase the emotional impact left by Halee's death. Cases like this also remind us of an important truth about homicide investigations. They are not simply collections of forensic reports, court filings, or crime scene photographs. At their center is always a human life, a family forever changed, friends left with unanswered questions, a future that vanished in a single moment. For law enforcement, the Rathgeber investigation reinforced the importance of patience and precision. Rather than relying on speculation, detectives painstakingly assembled evidence until they believed the facts could withstand scrutiny in court. Their work demonstrated that successful investigations are often built through persistence, attention to detail, and a commitment to following the evidence wherever it leads. For the public, Halee's story serves as a sobering reminder that acts of violence often emerge from personal relationships rather than encounters with strangers. It highlights the devastating consequences that unresolved conflict, financial pressures, and destructive decisions can have, not only for those directly involved, but also for the families and communities left behind. Nearly a decade has passed since that spring morning when Halee Rathgeber's body was discovered near the quiet soccer fields in Warwick County. The fields have long since returned to normal. Children once again play games on the nearby pitches. Families gather on weekends. Life has continued, as it inevitably does. Yet for those who knew Halee, the memory of April 24, 2017 remains frozen in time. Her absence is still felt, her story is still remembered, and her name continues to stand as a reminder of both the fragility of life and the enduring pursuit of justice. True crime documentaries often focus on the mystery of a case or the methods used to solve it. But beyond every investigation lies something far more important: the life of the victim. Halee Rathgeber was more than a case file, more than courtroom exhibits, more than headlines. She was a daughter, a student, a friend, a young woman with dreams that ended far too soon. By remembering who she was, not only how she died, we honor the purpose of telling stories like this. Not to glorify violence, not to sensationalize tragedy, but to preserve the truth, recognize the lives forever changed, and ensure that those taken too soon are never reduced to a single moment of darkness. This has been the true story of Halee Rathgeber, a life remembered, a crime investigated, and a pursuit of justice that ultimately reached its conclusion in a court of law, while leaving behind a legacy that extends far beyond the verdict itself. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary informative, consider subscribing for more carefully researched true crime stories based on verified facts, court records, and official investigations. Until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant, and remember that the most unsettling mysteries are often the ones hidden in plain sight.